I'm John Batchelor. Political earthquake is the defeat of Eric Cantor, the majority leader in the House of Representatives. Elected 2002, a young man born 1963, Richmond, Virginia, prominent in politics there for many years, defeated by a college professor, Randolph Macon, and economist, David Bratt. First time, to my knowledge, that he ran for federal office. Dave Bratt, appearing on local television in the last hours of the campaign, emphasized his fiscal responsibility, talked about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the overhang of debt, but he ended his remarks about immigration. He was asked about the 11 million in this country. Instead of responding on that, he pointed to the Drudge Report and mentioned 60,000 minors coming into the United States over the Mexican border and the crisis on the border. He did not say Eric Cantor did it. He didn't say Eric Cantor was at fault. He just mentioned it. Larry Kudlow of CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the Weekend is here with me as my colleague and co-host, and we welcome Bill Whalen of the Hoover Institution from Palo Alto. Bill is here to comment on the recent success of Neel Kashkari over Tim Donnelly in California's primary. That is an open primary where the top two finishers go on to the general election. And we're also going to comment on Mississippi, where there's a runoff on June 24th between the incumbent, Mr. Cochran, and the challenger, State Senator McDaniel. However, Bill, I want to begin with your comment on Eric Cantor, and the first thing I want is to establish a detail. Larry, didn't you say earlier that there was an unusually large turnout, or more than expected by the Cantor campaign?
Yeah, in brief, Cantor's pollster told me the turnout was much bigger than they thought, and they think a lot of Democrats crossed over and voted for Bratt.
All right, Bill, your comment on this, because this looks like an upset to the whole Republican Party. It is possible, however, that the turnout was a product of excitement over this unhappy, tragic report of these children coming across the border without adults. Is that also a major story in California? Is that sweeping the Republican Party, Bill? Good evening to you.
No, I mean, keep in mind, immigration's a fascinating issue on a lot of levels, and I love Larry's thoughts on this, too, as he's really at the forefront of this. You see polls that show a majority of Americans support immigration reform. You also find that the views differ across the country. Here in California, for example, we had a primary last week on Tuesday where the Republican winner, Neel Kashkari, is pro-reform. He talks very much about assimilation, expanding the party, and we have to have a solution to immigration reform. He defeated a gentleman who could not be more anti-immigration. The man was literally a Minuteman on the border. So in California, the referendum was in favor of somebody who supports reform. Now we switch to this week in Virginia, where the House Majority Leader, the number 2 man in the House, one of the most powerful men on the Hill, is not just defeated, but soundly rebuked. He was losing by about 10 percentage points the last I saw, and he's going down to a great extent because of immigration reform. But I think there's another lesson to take away from this. What's interesting tonight is that you have 2 primaries going on in the Confederacy, literally the heart and soul of the Confederacy. Richmond, near Appomattox, where the Confederates ended up surrendering, and South Carolina, where the first shot was fired in the war. What you see in Richmond is that Eric Cantor was defeated by the Tea Party without really working to try to get around the Tea Party in his race. He sort of took him head-on immigration, and he paid a price for it. But you go down to South Carolina, where Lindsey Graham is running for re-election in the Senate primary, and this is a man just despised by a lot of Tea Party activists, and we might have thought a year ago on the show that he would be in deep trouble. He's breezing the re-election in part because he found a way to work the system. He cut off his opposition. He adopted a lot of Tea Party themes, and he's being rewarded for it tonight.
And he ran on national security, Bill. He ran heavily, and South Carolina's a big defense state. And you know, Lindsey's a great politician, and he's home all the time. And when he's not home, he's on television blasting Obama's incoherent foreign policy position, including this insane prisoner swap that we just had in Afghanistan and Gitmo. I mean, I think Lindsey played his cards really well. And I agree with your other point. I don't think Eric Cantor played his cards very well at all. I don't think Eric Cantor ever really took this seriously until the last 8 or 10 days of the campaign. By then it was too late. And as John says, with all these children crossing the border, wow, couldn't have happened on a worse night for Cantor.
Yeah, he did. You know, one other thing, Larry, Eric Cantor had plenty of warning about this. Even though we might have predicted he would lose, Virginia was racked by this dispute last year. Remember, its governor's race, where the Tea Party rose, and they changed how they did the convention, and they produced Ken Cuccinelli as their gubernatorial nominee. So, you know, hindsight is always 20/20, but perhaps at that time, Cantor should have looked at the results, saw the anger there, and tried to find a way to harness it, but he did not.
You cannot say, Bill, and I'll assert this as a question, you cannot say that Eric Cantor was defeated because he's not conservative. That is a conservative Republican.
No. he wasn't. I think he was defeated by, I think, what I'd call a sort of series of concussive blows to the head. It's immigration, yes, but it's also bailouts, and it's the size of government, and it's frustration with government. You know what else did him in? Social media and talk radio. Laura Ingraham, Mark Levin, and Glenn Beck all took David Bratt, the opponent, on their show. They all embraced him. They all campaigned, and they spent their time trashing the leader, and you have to believe that was a factor in this as well.
Off to California, because a week ago, our concern was Neil Kashkari coming in number 3 to Tim Donnelly, a state assemblyman who'd been associated with immigration over the years. He'd led, I think, he'd boasted of forming an armed group on the border once upon a time, and he said many things that are unacceptable towards Mexicans. However, the very last weekend, Neil Kashkari overtook him. What did it, Bill?
The Kashkari campaign got its act together down the home stretch. He put some of his own finances into it. Some independent expenditures were done on his behalf. They went on television. His opponent was dark, and it was enough to get Neil by on a primary night. And the party just breathes a collective sigh of relief, because now you have a standard bearer who you don't have to run from, and you're especially relieved if you're down the ticket, because if the standard bearer had been Tim Donnelly, every race around California would have been a referendum on immigration. Would have been a referendum on gun control. It would have put Republicans in just fundamentally defensive spots, because keep in mind this is pretty much a blue state. With Kashkari, you don't have that. So now with Kashkari, at least you have a potential for a more creative campaign, a truly happier warrior than Tim Donnelly would ever be, and he probably will not beat Jerry Brown, but I think he'd give him just a much better race than Donnelly ever could.
You know, Bill, I was at a book party tonight, and I bumped into a guy who's a former California State Republican chairman, a youngish guy. You probably know him. But anyway, he said to me that he was so happy, and the professionals were so happy, because the under ticket will now survive. And there's some pretty good races for the House and Congress, as well as the state Senate and state Assembly. The under ticket will survive because of Kashkari's win.
Yeah, that is exactly right, Larry. The action is really down the ticket. It's Brown is pretty near certain to get reelected, so you have to look at some statewide races, the most interesting one being the state controller's race. This is the chief budget officer for the state government. Very attractive candidate for Republicans, the mayor of Fresno, Ashley Swearingen. So keep an eye on that. But then the action goes further down the ticket, and you get into legislative races. The Democrats desperately want to get their supermajority back in Sacramento. Why? With the supermajority, you can do whatever you want to. You can put ballots, measures on the ballot, lickety-split. You can pass taxes, whatever you want to do. They don't have that now. They want to get that back. And then thirdly, both parties are looking at congressional races. There's a chance Republicans actually pick up 2 or 3 seats here. Had Donnelly been the nominee, it would have been the other way, Democrats licking their chops and probably picking up seats. So it's just a much better situation for the Republicans than it was a week ago. And the thing about Donnelly's campaign, which will be interesting to watch, is this. Once you win a primary, you make the pivot. So let's see how Neil pivots out of this. If I were advising him for what it's worth, I'd have him give 2 big speeches. One is you go against Jerry on the record, and you pretty much point out one thing in particular, his embrace of high-speed rail, which just does not add up on the sheer logic of it. You throw in the fact that the newly constructed Bay Bridge is just a rickety bag of bolts right now, and just make people feel uncertain about this massive public labor construction project. But then secondly, what I would do if I were Kashkari is I would give a forward-looking speech on immigration reform and beat Brown to the punch. Because here's where I think Jerry Brown is weak as a candidate. The governor of California, representing this nation state with the largest immigrant population in America, should be leading the charge in Washington for immigration reform, bringing together a band of governors, calling for reform, offering ideas, putting pressure on Congress to act. Jerry is MIA on this, so if I'm Kashkari, I'd go out and get that speech that helps with the party's rebranding and puts the governor on the defensive over the issue.
Quickly, Bill, to 2 states very different from California. Mississippi, where Mr. Cochran is now in a runoff with a state Senator McDaniel. And one comment on there, I'd also like to point to Iowa, where a state legislature was endorsed in these last hours of the campaign by Mr. Rubio, Mr. Romney, and Ms. Palin, all 3 coming together for a win. I believe she wasn't the most Tea Party of candidates of the 5. So first, Mississippi. Are you surprised that McDaniel came from out of nowhere, Bill?
No, Thad Cochran's been in the Senate for 41 years, if I'm not mistaken. There was a lot of question if he was going to bother to run a race at all. When he decided to run, he didn't really run much of a campaign. I view politicians very much as dairy products, and sometimes they have reached an expiration date, and it would appear that Senator Cochran is that way. And I would, if I had to bet money, I'd suspect he's going down in the runoff.
I love that. I've never heard that before. Dairy products. That's wonderful.
Larry, you are looking to talk to Mr. McDaniel.
Yes.
I admire Mr. McDaniel because he's a great campaigner. He would do well in the 19th century. He'll do well in the 22nd century. The man's got energy.
Well, I think you're right. I think Bill Whalen's right. Cochrane, who was first elected in the latter part of the 19th century, has no energy whatsoever. And even worse, to my way of thinking, okay, because I like the Tea Party's platform in fiscal issues, Cochrane is a pork barreler. He is an earmarker. He is an appropriation spender. And if he were to win and they won the Senate, he would be the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is exactly what I don't want. So I confess I'm pulling for McDaniel.
And you're going to speak to the state senator at Larry.
I am. He's going to be on the radio with me Saturday.
Good. So we'll hear from Mr. McDaniel on Larry's show on Saturday. Now to Iowa. 43 years old, a military veteran, state senator, and apparently she grew up on a farm and has a intimate relationship with farm animals in some fashion. She talked about pigs and cutting pork, and it was a spectacular video. But I'm struck by the fact, Bill, that she not only was endorsed by the Tea Party, the establishment, and you'd have to say Marco Rubio wondering in between, but also she's now pointing ahead of her rival, the Bruce Braley, and the Democrats are stunned in Iowa, Bill.
Yeah, she has, I think, about a 1 or 2 point lead on him now. That could be a bit of a bump coming out of the primary, but now that's a close race, and in theory a doable race for Republicans. So now we're getting to the question of how the Republicans pick up their 6 seats. 3 of them seem to be pretty easy pickups. That's West Virginia, South Dakota, and Montana. So where do the other 3 come from? You're looking at Louisiana, Arkansas, North Carolina. Then you want to sort of spread out the blast zone and see what else you can pick up. And this school of thought. One is that the Republicans are going to fall shy. They're not going to get up to 6. They're going to get maybe 4 or 5. The other is that they barely make it, but the other is that it's a surprisingly good night, in which case they pick up maybe 8, 9, or 10. In that case, Iowa's in the mix. By the way, about Joni Ernst, this is the power of social media. They put the ad on cable television at Des Moines. Her line is that she grew up castrating hogs on a farm in Iowa, so she knows how to cut pork. Ha ha ha.
Is that what John Batchelor was referring to,
yes,
Bill, when
yes.
he said she had an intimate relationship with farm animals?
Yes,
well, he's being more diplomatic than I am.
Yes.
So it's hog castration. So the beauty of this ad was that her campaign put it up on cable television in Des Moines. It spent, I think, $6,000 on the buy. But once people heard what this ad was about, they quickly rushed to YouTube. It got 600,000 views on YouTube. Now, granted, a lot of that's outside of Iowa, but it just sort of dominated the water cooler talk in the election, and it's all people could get around. So sometimes one ad can make an enormous difference.
I'm beginning to think that porcine does very well in the Elephant's Party. You'll recall that Governor Palin mentioned lipstick on a pig when she was so successful in the campaign of 2008, and now Joni Ernst is. The point here is this blending of Tea Party establishment and Marco Rubio. Is that striking to you, Larry?
Yes and no. I mean, I agree with what Bill is saying here. I think I don't see, okay, step back. I personally don't see the Tea Party versus establishment internecine warfare that was so widely predicted by the New York, Washington Beltway media. I think it's popped up, but again, tonight in Virginia, I don't see it that way. I see tonight in Virginia not as Tea Party, as immigration.
Right.
I don't even think Brat likes the Tea, or he's not in favor of the Tea Party. So you go to Iowa or you go to Nebraska, and you see a lot of unity, and the Tea Party couldn't make a strong showing. And I think that's what this gal did in Iowa. I think the trouble here is going to be what the GOP is going to say about immigration, about minority groups reach out, and about the Big Tent. And I agree with Bill Whalen regarding Neil Kashkari's campaign. He should go for the Big Tent right away, and I think he will. But what about the rest of the GOP? After tonight's drubbing of Eric Cantor, what are they going to say about immigration and the Big Tent? I think this is becoming a wedge issue inside the Republican Party, and I can't think of anything worse.
Larry Kudlow?
Larry's absolutely right. Look, you're going to see on Sunday talk shows, you're going to see two factions of Republicans. There is the John McCain side of things, which is the party better reform, and reform now if it has any prayer of winning in 2016. But then there is the Steve King, the congressman from Iowa school of thought. He calls himself part of the Watchtower 24/7 crowd. In other words, they're just not going to let anything get through the House.
Larry Kudlow, CNBC, and Kudlow Radio on the weekend. Bill Whalen of the Hoover Institution. Eric Cantor is defeated in his primary. It's an earthquake. I'm John Batchelor.